So we're going to continue our study tonight in the books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. We really don't have a great deal as far as numbers of chapters that we want to cover tonight, but the fact of the matter is even though we're only covering roughly 4 chapters or 4.5 chapters, we're covering a great number of a number of different kings in this section, so we need to kind of press onward to kind of cover this section of history. But before we get started, I want to kind of just go back and kind of look at this chart and look at some of the kings that we'll be looking at during this period of history. In 2 classes ago, we looked at Jehu of Israel, who was really a sword in the God's hands to execute judgment on Ahab and Jezebel. And we looked at Jehu as he went out and he killed all the descendants of Ahab and Jezebel, and also went to the south and killed Ahaziah in Judah. Last week, we looked at Ahaziah's son Joash and how he was largely influenced by the priest Jehoiada. And as long as Jehoiada remained alive and was a positive influence, Joash stayed true to the Lord. But as we look at this chart, there's some things that I want us to just kind of remind us of or to bring to the fore. Want to try it?
Test. Okay. I think I got it.
And the very first thing I want us to do as we kind of look at this chart is just notice that between Ahaziah and his son Joash, there is a time gap between the stages of their rule, or the dates of their rule. And the reason you kind of see that is we suggested last time that Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, usurped the throne, and she ruled for roughly 7 years before she was deposed. And she murdered all of her grandchildren, but Joash survived because of the efforts of Jehoiada and his wife. The second thing, I want to highlight these 4 kings of Israel. Now, Jehu was promised back in 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 30 that his descendants would rule for 4 generations. So these next 4 kings, Jehoahaz, Joash of Israel, Jeroboam II, and Zechariah, are all descendants of Jehu and are fulfillment of the prophetic promise made to Jehu because he was willing to serve the Lord. And so when we look at these kings, we're going to be looking at details of their reign, but in the overarching picture, I want you to just see the fact because they ascended the throne, they're really in response to God's promise. The fact that they existed at all and ruled at all was in answer to God's promise to Jehu. The second thing I want us to look at is these 2 kings that kind of roughly correspond to each other, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and that would be Azariah or Uzziah and Jeroboam II. These 2 kings, they kind of overlap, but I want you to understand that this period in both the south and the north was one of the most prosperous periods in all of the periods of the times of the kingdoms, both united and divided. And the fact of the matter is during the reigns of Jeroboam II and Azariah, it rivaled the time of King David and King Solomon. And the really strange thing, a couple of things I want to just notice about that, is despite the fact that God had blessed them and they had these great periods of prosperity, they just simply were growing more wicked. And that seems almost counterintuitive, right? You think when things are bad, right, they're wicked. Well, the fact of the matter is God is blessing them during this period of time and giving them respite from their enemies, but they didn't use that opportunity to turn to the Lord, but just simply grew further and further away from the Lord. The other interesting thing about this, you know how much is said about Jeroboam II? Not much. The fact is, though, from a world standpoint, Jeroboam II was a prosperous, successful king. But from the writers of the Bible, they were concerned about his spiritual aptitude, and he failed miserably. So they didn't say a lot about how he was successful in expanding the borders of the kingdom. We can kind of read of their prosperity over in the book of Amos and places like Amos chapter 6 and verses 4 through 8, where the prophet Amos, he was from the tribe of Judah, he's from the southern kingdom and went and prophesied to the north. And Amos talked about their wealth and how they oppressed the poor, and it just talked about the general culture of the time. So, one other thing I want to say before we get into this. This period of history, these sections of Kings, is probably one of the sections of history that has the world at large, the world stage at large, has a great deal of impact on these kings and what they do. Especially two nations. We've been looking at the nation of Syria or Aram, but also the Assyrian Empire. And what I mean by that is these two nations, these two world powers of this time, as their power waxes and wanes, will determine how the kings of Israel do, how successful they are. Are they going to be in turmoil? Are they going to be persecuted? Are they able to reign successfully? And so there's some dates. Whatever here. Like in 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 5, God is going to raise up a deliverer so that they'll have respite or peace. We don't know who that deliverer is, but one suggestion is it's the nation of Assyria. They started growing stronger, and it caused the king Hazael to kind of pull back, and therefore gave Israel a chance to kind of recoup some of their losses. But I just want you to see how they wax and wane kind of influence the nation. Some important dates regarding these two kingdoms. We have King Hazael, who's always been a thorn in the side of the people of God. He dies in 806, and his son Ben-Hadad III becomes king. Eventually, Assyria defeats Syria in 802, but Assyria doesn't kind of push their advantage. They don't go on until Tiglath-Pileser III in roughly 755 becomes on the throne, and that's where Assyria starts asserting their dominance and start subjugating people and translocating people. But those two nations have a great deal of impact on the period of history that we're looking at. So, all that being said, let's turn our attention and look at the text itself and the kings that it speaks of. And the very first king that we're going to look at is Jehoahaz of Israel, found in the first 9 verses of 2 Kings 13. The text tells us that he reigned for 17 years. So he was on the throne for 17 years. And as you read through the text, what stands out to you about Jehoahaz and his reign? What seems remarkable about it? What does the writer note about him? Because in 9 verses, he basically summarizes this 17 years of reign. What does he note that is significant about him? He did evil. Okay? Right. He continues in the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and he did not turn away from that idolatrous state religion that Jeroboam I established in the northern kingdoms. He didn't turn away from that. What else is noted about it?
When things went bad, he treated God, went before God, and God was forgiving.
Isn't that a head scratcher? He's one of the few northern kings that turned and sought the Lord. That's unusual about Jehoahaz. And it's noteworthy because most of the kings were so prideful and full of themselves, they would not seek the Lord no matter how bad it became. But Jehoahaz sought the favor of the Lord. It seems to me, at least the writer of Kings, he lays out 3 sets of actions and reactions here in this text, and that really define the reign of Jehoahaz. And it starts with the fact that he continued in the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and didn't turn aside. Because he chose to do that, what was the Lord's reaction? Notice, look here in the text. It says, so the anger, verse 3, of the Lord kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually in the hand of Hazael and in the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. Because they continued to follow in the sin of Jeroboam and did not turn aside, that's the reaction of the Lord. The Lord grew angry. But as they were oppressed, as Matt pointed out, they turned and they sought the Lord. He sought the Lord's favor. And you know what the Lord did when he turned and sought his favor? He said, I'm going to raise up a deliverer for you. That's what he says in verse 5 of the text. He was going to raise up a deliverer so that they escape from under the hands of the Arameans. So when he turned and sought the Lord's favor, the Lord was merciful. The Lord was gracious. Here's this wicked king who did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, but as soon as he was willing to entreat the Lord was gracious in his response. But then there's a third notable set here. So even though the Lord raised up a deliverer and what allowed them to escape the oppression of the Arameans, did they show gratitude to God? I mean, wouldn't you think I'm going down this road, if I stay on this sin with the sons of Jeroboam, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to get oppressed. But the oppression, that causes me to turn to God. And you know what happens when I turn to God? God sends a deliverer and releases me. You know what I ought to do? Keep following the sins of the son of Jeroboam. They took this opportunity of God's graciousness. It didn't cause them to draw closer to God. The fact of the matter is it seemed almost entrenched Jehoahaz in his court more. And as a result of that, it led to the nation's weakness. Look, if you will, in verse 7 of the text. And so after all of these events transpired, it said, he left to Jehoahaz of the army not more than 50 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000 footmen. For the king of Aram had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. Do you see how far the nation of Israel had sunk? I mean, just think about that. 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 footmen. That's it. That's it of an army that once boasted in the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands at various points in their history, because they continued to walk in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And so that's the first king that we see of Israel, one of the first descendants of Jehu. Anybody got anything that they'd like to throw in here on these first 9 verses? Anything that stands out to you? Okay. Well, now we move to the second descendant of Jehu, that is Joash, or his longer version of his name, Jehoash. And you'll see it in both spellings, both spellings throughout the text. We're going to go with Joash because I can't pronounce the other one, so we're going to go with that. And he's found really in verses 10 through 25 of 2 Kings 13. It's said for him, again, he reigned 16 years. What I love about these periods of history is how they can take a decade-long kingdom and summarize it in 9 verses, or in this case, 15 to 16 verses. So they took over a decade and a half and condensed it to this text. And I tell you, the story of Joash of Israel is a weird story. It's weird in the sense of how it's told, because everything is told in relation to others, right? It's not told like this happened to Joash, he did this, he did that. No, we're told about Elisha. We're told about his interaction with Amaziah of the south. Everything about Joash is told in how he interacts or relates to others. So it's kind of told a little bit weirdly. So let's just look at some of the highlights of his text, and then want to ask a few questions as we go along. The very first thing it notes in verse 11 of chapter 13, he, like his predecessor, his father, does not turn from the sin of Jeroboam. He continues the idol worship that Jeroboam had set up in the north. But strangely, when he hears the news that Elisha is dying, that he's sick and on his deathbed, what's he go and do? What's he go do? And what does he say about it? Look at verse 14 of the text. How does he address Elisha there? Father. Look at verse 14. As Matt said, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Isn't that kind of weird? So here he is following after this idolatrous religion established by Jeroboam. And in many cases, Elisha would have been his enemy, at least not his enemy as much as the one who rebuked him and admonished him and exhorted him. But when he hears about Elisha's death, he comes to his side, or is nearing his death, he comes to his side, my father, my father. There seems to be a sense of intimacy, a sense of respect at least. Okay? What does he mean by calling Elisha, do you think, the horses and chariots of Israel? My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. What do you think he means by that, potentially, by calling Elisha that?
Well, you identified that 2 or 3 weeks ago as coming aboard to take Elisha, that language.
Yeah, so we see similar language with Elijah when Elijah is taken to heaven, right? So we see similar language. So we have this correspondence between, or parallelism between Elijah and Elisha. But what does it say about Elisha? You are the chariot and horseman. I tell you what I think he's saying. Now, whether he means it or not, I don't know. But I think what he's saying about Elisha is, you know what the true protection of Israel is? It's not our horses and chariots. It's you. I think it is meant to be seen as a compliment, a recognition that Elisha, as God's prophet, was actually the true protector of Israel. He was their horses and their chariots. So you have this kind of, this juxtaposition of these two almost opposite or contrasting ideas. But then we have these issues with Elisha, and we're going to look at this a little bit more, where Elisha gives instructions to Joash. First of all, he's to shoot an arrow out the window. Then he's to take the arrows and strike the ground. And what does he do when Elisha tells him to use the arrows to strike the ground? Yeah. And is that acceptable to Elisha? No, he gets angry. He said, you should have done it 5 or 6 times. So the only reason I put these up there is this just is a kind of a complex individual that I can't get a handle on. So he follows in an idolatrous religion, but he seems to have a great deal of regard for Elisha. But when Elisha gives him instruction, he doesn't follow through with it. So you just kind of see this person that's kind of conflicted and kind of divided. What else do we see? He gets relief. Did you see at the very end of chapter 13 that Hazael, and it says in verse 22, now Hazael, king of Aram, had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, his father. Verse 24, when Hazael, king of Aram, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Then Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. So he got some relief. And he was able to regain some of this territory that his father lost. But how was he able to do that? Notice in verse 23, the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them and turned to them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now. So even with this wicked king and everything you do, God still is showing compassion and mercy, not only for the sake of Joash, but because he had entered into this covenant. He was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so he gave them relief. And then we have this episode where he goes to war with Amaziah. Amaziah, we're going to look at in just a moment. Amaziah, the king of Judah, after defeating the people of Edom, he seems to be full of himself and prideful, and he challenges, and we're going to look at the reasons for that in just a moment. He challenges Joash, and Joash, lack of a better term, even though he initially says he doesn't want to go to war, he talks smack, right? That's what he does. He tells Amaziah, you ought to go sit down before you take your licking. You ought to be satisfied with the victories that you've gained. But Amaziah doesn't listen. And as a result, Joash takes him captive for a period of time. He breaks through the walls of Jerusalem, and then he sacks Jerusalem, and he takes hostages. I bring up that hostages just if you look over in chapter 14 and verse 14. That's one of the few occasions in these wars between Judah and Israel that we have captives taken. It's actually one of the first times that we have that as a significant portion of their warfare. But we just see this, and that's his kingship. And what you get with this individual is a person who's conflicted. He's not, I don't think he knows which direction he wants to go. On one hand, he calls Elisha my father and the chariot and horsemen of Israel, and on another, he's not willing to listen to him. On one hand, he tells Amaziah to go home, we shouldn't fight, and then on the other hand, he takes him hostage and sacks Jerusalem and the kingdom. We have this individual who's the second of the generations of Jehu. Anybody got anything they want to throw in there that they want to add to this? And then that you stood out for you in that text? Okay. Let's move on and spend just a little bit of time up with Elisha, because this is the end of an era. A big section of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings are tied up with Elisha and his predecessor, Elijah. Elisha served in his ministry as kind of, I'm going to use this terminology, as the head prophet or the prophet supreme, because he seemed to be the one who's most notable in this time for 56 years. He and Elijah, his predecessor, over 1/3 of the book, of the material found in 1st and 2nd Kings, are tied up with those two men, stories about those two men. And so in some ways, while we call these the books of the kings, quite frankly, they're books of prophecy. The largest focus is how God is sovereign and interacts in human affairs through his prophets. We still see God as a major component of these things. And we made the notation that Joash, who would have been one that Elisha had to stand against, had to possibly rebuke, or because of his cultic influences, he comes and pays homage. And that kind of creates for us, I believe, the very first lesson I want to talk about from here. I ran across this quote in kind of preparing this lesson. It said this: "Dear friends, let us seek so to live that even ungodly men may miss us when we're gone." And I mean, that seems to be what we have in this relationship with Joash and Elisha. Even men who are ungodly recognize Elisha as such a God-fearing man, a godly man, that even at his deathbed, he would come and offer a word of praise to Elisha and his service to the nation. But there's 3 events that kind of are noted here in this text about Elisha. And I think in some ways they stand for something greater than themselves. I hope you see that when we kind of go through that. The first one is found in verses 15 through 17 of 2 Kings chapter 13. So what does Elisha tell Joash to do? What's his instruction? What's he supposed to do? Okay. Where's he going to shoot it? What's he going to do? It says in verse 15, he's to take these bows and arrows. He's to shoot them out the window toward the east. He's commanded to shoot, and he shot. And what is that to stand for?
The victory over Syria.
Yeah. So, first of all, it refers, can you think, he mentions a specific place, Aphek. And you know that's where Ahab gained a victory over Syria. But what he's really saying is shoot this bow and you're going to get this relief. Times are going to be good again. But I want us to pay particular attention how he instructs him to shoot. Look at verse 16. It said, "Then he said to the king of Israel, 'Put your hands on the bow.' And he put his hands on it. Then Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands." So think about that. So Joash is going to draw the bow, but whose hands are on top of his? What do you think that might stand for? Who is shooting the bow? Who's giving the victory? It's God, right? God is directing the arrow. The fact of the matter is, when you look there in verse 17, it's the Lord's arrow of victory. It wasn't Joash just pulling and by his might casting this arrow out. It was the Lord. It was the Lord's prophets who directed his hands and directed his aim. And I think in some ways that's meant to show us that the Lord was going to grant this victory. So what's the second event? Well, he's told to take some of those same arrows and strike the ground. First of all, that's a weird thing. Are you normally supposed to strike the ground with arrows? I mean, some suggest he might have been shooting them, but most of the people believe it just like he's supposed to be whacking the ground. Well, it's kind of a weird sign anyway. But what he does, he strikes the ground 3 times. Elisha grows angry because he should have struck it 5 to 6 times, he says. And what was that to stand for? Yeah. So it determines the degree of destruction that Aram would have gone through. So Joash was not committed to fully destroying them, so he only hit it 3 times. If he had hit it 5 or 6, they'd been fully destroyed. And it kind of measured or meted out their level of destruction. The final one, the final event in Elisha's life here, happens after his death. So he dies, he's buried, and then the Moabites, who apparently invaded at various points, and the Moabites were coming and they were digging a grave and getting ready to bury a guy, and they saw this force coming, and they got excited or nervous or scared, and they just threw the body in the grave, and the body hit the bones of Elisha. And the body reanimated, came back to life. What's that mean? I mean, we know the scene, but what could that stand for? Think about it as a message to the people at this time. What could it stood for? I mean, here we've got this power from beyond the grave. I think there's a couple of ideas I'll just throw out for your consideration. First of all, I think it may be pointing to the idea that the power is in God himself and not his messenger. God's promises are still in force even if the messenger dies. The promises that Elisha made on behalf of God are still in play even though he himself is in the grave. It points to really the enduring word of the Lord, that even death is not in any way a hindrance to the Lord's promises or power. It seems to stand for that. And I'll just tell you that it seems to point to the idea that Elisha had the same power in death that Elijah did in life. This is the only time that, so remember Elijah raised those from the dead? Here, Elisha in his death, just by being touched or bringing life to people. And that just points to the power of God and the power that he granted to his prophets. And so that ends an era with these prophets, these 2 main guys, Elijah and Elisha. Anybody got anything? Bob, and then Matt.
Sort of minor point with that word for when Joyce says, Father, Father, the chariots and horses. That term for father, this abi in Hebrew, it doesn't mean father, it means masters. And I kind of think of the relationship that Saul and Samuel had. He respected him and appreciated him as a prophet of God, but he did not seem
Good point. Hey, everybody hear that? So Bob pointed out the difference in the words used for father, father, or oh my father is a term that has more to do with master than like a paternal relationship or endearing relationship. So it may have had more to do with respect and honoring him as a prophet versus any personal relationship. Is that a good? So Matt, good point. Matt?
The striking the ground, I read, somebody suggested that this is actually him shooting the arrows. That when you shoot an arrow, it's going to strike the ground. And what is unfortunate is that Joash has already heard the pronouncement of what that first arrow shot was going to bring about. And that was victory over Syria. So if in fact, I mean, I used to think he was just striking the ground, but if in fact the phraseology here is to shoot, because an arrow shot will strike the ground, then he should have been shooting every arrow in the quiver. Because he knew that the first arrow shot what it represented.
Victory.
Victory, and he should have shot every arrow he could get his hands on, but he stopped short, which I think is a demonstration a little bit of a lack of faith.
Amen. So, and now on those 2 points, or a couple points, I just want to draw a couple applications, one building on Matt's there in just a moment. It says, I run across this quote that I think is kind of neat. It says, there are many situations in which we should keep shooting the arrows, but we content ourselves with a small effort. He should have continued smiting till the prophet had said enough, kind of building on Matt's point. And you think about that in our lives. There's times we don't stop shooting. Be ye faithful even until death. You've not resisted to the point of shedding of blood in your efforts against sin. On and on. We got to keep shooting the arrows, striking the ground. Gary?
The expression, just enough to get by, in all my years of teaching, I had several students who did just enough to get by when they could have done so much more. You know, not the grades were the only thing, but their attitude was learning. Doing just enough to get by. And that typifies us at times too.
Amen. One other quote, that's another great point. It says, this author I was reading who made some reflections on Elisha's life, he just said, Joash's life, he says, we think of all the excuses that Joash could have made, yet none of them are valid. He says, I stopped shooting because I didn't think it would do any good. I stopped shooting because I wasn't in the shooting mood. I just didn't feel like it. And he just went on and lists some others. As Gary kind of pointed out, just doing enough to get by. And none of those excuses were valid. It angered the prophet of God. So that represented this period of time with Elisha. And I know we're kind of pushing on, but we need to turn our attention to Amaziah of Judah. He reigned for 29 years in Judah. And it says in verse 3 of chapter 14, notice this. He did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his fathers. What do you think that means? That he did right in the eyes of the Lord, yet not like his father David. What do you think that means? Nancy? Yeah, and I think that Nancy is on to something, because when you compare the two events, that seems to be the main thing. He seemed to be spiritually better than most, but he didn't serve or commit himself with the whole heart. And you find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 25 and verse 2. And then you find it typified in how he lived in the following verses in chapter 14 and verses 4 through 6. So just look at what he did in verses 4 through 6. It said down in verse 5, now it came about as soon as the kingdom was firmly in his hand that he killed his servants who had slain the king his father. But the sons of the slayers he did not put to death according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses. So you remember his father was executed or murdered. And it says once he took control of the land, he had his father's executors put to death, but didn't kill their sons. He wasn't like Jehu that just let his vengeance run out of control. And the reason he did that was because of what it says in the law of Moses. But look back up at verse 4. What did he do in verse 4? Only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high place. Does the law of Moses say anything about that? So you see this guy, it's got a divided heart, right? He wasn't serving the Lord with his whole heart. On one occasion, he's quoting from the law of Moses and using that to guide his actions, but in other places, at least when it comes to the high places, he chose not to. The main thing it notes about him is that he defeated Edom. Edom, that nation to the south, shows on the map. What basically we see with Amaziah, he's pushing the borders of Judah south and it kind of enlarging the nation. But then we have, after his defeat of Edom, that interplay with Joash of Israel, and they go to war. And the question's why? Why would Amaziah challenge Joash? Did he just not like him? Well, there's a number of things in the text. It seems like when Amaziah was setting out to conquer Edom, he tried to hire mercenaries from Israel for 100 talents of silver. And then a man of God came and said, you can't do that. They're wicked. God doesn't approve of them. So he dismissed them. And when he dismissed those mercenaries, they got mad. Said their anger burned fiercely. And as they went up back to Israel through Judah, they killed some people of Judah, and they seemed to plunder certain places. So Amaziah, after defeating Edom, had this sense of, had a cause to vindicate against Israel. When Joash mentioned, it seemed like Amaziah grew proudful. He says he had talked about his pride. He let this victory go to his heart. So he engaged in war with Joash. Then the question is why did he lose? Well, he lost. Because you know what he did when he defeated Edom? He took their gods, their idols, and he made them his gods. And he burned incense to them. And so the Lord's anger burned against them. Look, if you will, over in 2 Kings chapter, where am I here? I'm losing my mind. So we'll just look at 2 Chronicles, excuse me. In chapter 25 and verse 14. It says, now after Amaziah came from slaughtering the Edomites, he brought the gods of the sons of Seir, set them up as his gods, and bowed down before them, and burned incense to them. Then the anger of the Lord burned against Amaziah, and he sent him a prophet who said to him, why have you sought the gods of the people who have not delivered their own people from your hand? And he was talking with him. The king said to him, have we appointed you a royal counselor? Stop. Why should you be struck down? Then the prophet stopped and said, I know that God has planned to destroy you because you have done this and have not listened to my counsel. Do you see what the man of God said to him? I mean, he set up these idols and he said, that makes no sense. Didn't you just defeat this nation? Why would you turn around and bow down to the gods of a nation you just defeated, let alone what you know about the God of Israel? And so his anger burned and he spoke of his defeat. And what we have with Amaziah is he ends up with an ignoble death, as you read in verses 19 through 20. He seemed to survive. Josephus said after Joash sacked Jerusalem, Amaziah was released, and he lived 15 years beyond the life of Joash. But it seemed like a conspiracy arose that was against Amaziah, and he had to flee to Lachish, a city of the Philistines, and there he was killed and brought back to Jerusalem. So let's keep running real quick. Azariah of Judah, we might know him about Uzziah. He was 16 when he was made king, and he ruled for 52 years. The text says that all the people made him king. He seemed to have a lot of popular support, and some suggest that he may have had a hand in the conspiracy against his father. There's nothing in the text to support that other than supposition, but it's a fairly popular supposition. And his reign is kind of summarized over in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. And I want to just note this real quick in verses 4 and 5. It said of Uzziah in his early part of his reign, he did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He continued to seek the God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding through the vision of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God prospered him. So his reign is his early part of his reign is he did well. And it says, as long as he sought the Lord, God continued to prosper him. And that's what we see beginning in the early part of his reign. I mean, as you go down in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, he warred against the Philistines, and God helped him. He warred against the Arabians, the Ammonites. He extended his fame as far as the borders of Egypt. He built internal building projects in Jerusalem. He had a lot of success, and Judah grew. But what can success do to an individual? And that's what happened to Uzziah. Look at verse 16. But when he became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly. And he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, for he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of it. I mean, he waxed proud. So proud that he established himself as a priest and would offer incense to the Lord. Azariah and 80 other valiant men opposed him. He was struck with leprosy, and the remainder of his days he was cut off from the house of the Lord. Quickly, Jeroboam II. Very few verses. But what we'll note, he reigned 41 years. We have a summary of his reign in verse 24 of chapter 14. There in the text, it simply says this: he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. But the thing is about Jeroboam, that's all we got. But you know, in 25 years of his reign, he turned the tide of the nation of Israel. You remember at the end of Joash's reign, they had 10 chariots, 50 horsemen, 10,000 foot soldiers. Under Jeroboam, the borders extended to the time of the days of King Solomon. So in 25 years, he turned things around with the help of the Lord. And then eventually the rule passed to his son, Zechariah. I want to do these quickly. I'm about out of time. But we had made mention of this, that Uzziah and Jeroboam II's reign were extremely profitable and significant. It said the era of Jeroboam and the northern kingdom and Azariah of the southern kingdom would mark a significant change in the fortunes of God's people. These would be days of unparalleled prosperity for the twin kingdoms, both economically and politically. And they had this period of blessing and respite that should have caused them to draw closer to God. But during this time, they wove the rope that they were going to hang themselves from. When we start looking at this period outside the books of Chronicles and Kings, we see how God, during this time, was blessing these people with a purpose. We see in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25, Jonah, the son of Amittai of Gath-Hepher, is mentioned. And he says, I'm going to allow their borders to extend to the lengths, the time of King Solomon. In God's actions and attitude toward them during this period of time, it was one of love, like a husband loves toward his wife, according to Hosea 1 through 3. He tried to turn them from their sin in Amos chapter 4. And he delayed judgment in Amos chapter 7. That's what God was doing during the time of Jeroboam II and during the reign of Uzziah. God was allowing them to be blessed and be prospered with the desire that they would turn back to him. That's not what they did. The fact of the matter is, as we read through these two prophets, we see these they're spiritual adulterers. They oppress the poor. They show injustice and immorality. That's what the people did with their time. Instead of turning to the Lord, they turned to their own devices. And as a result, after Jeroboam and after Uzziah, there was not a great deal of stability in their nation. In the south, it was going to be a while before the nation was taken into captivity, but they had no lasting peace really from that point on. To the north, their days were written in finite numbers after the days of Jeroboam II, because despite all of God's care to try to draw them back to himself, they refused to be drawn. Thank you all. We're out of time. Sorry about the speed run there, but we had a lot of kings to